hear me? Is this turned on? Okay. Good evening and welcome to the 20th in the Roundtable series at Parliament House, New South Wales. We've been doing this thing for 6.5 years and we have no conscience in the matter. We're very glad to be back and we're very glad that you're back. Don't take any notice of that noise in the background. It's parliamentary procedure. Doesn't mean you have to leave. It's not fire drill. This is the 20th in the Roundtable series of public forums on issues of concern to thinking people in the community. That's us. Now, it's very important to know that we have no links with any political party or organisation, with any church, religion or cult, with any business or motivational group. Our motto is very simple: we serve truth, not consensus. That puts us outside of any political involvement. We're totally non-profit. Any surplus funds are ploughed back and spent on internet publicity, printed material, and expenses such as running forums like this one. The first speaker among our three distinguished speakers is Emeritus Professor David Flint, AM. Professor David Flint is an Australian legal academic known for his leadership of Australians for Constitutional Monarchy and for his tenure as head of Australian Broadcasting Authority. David is one of Australia's most prominent constitutional monarchists. His book, The Cane-Toed Republic, was used in the 1999 referendum campaign. This was followed in 2003 by Twilight of the Elites in support of Australia's current constitutional arrangements and the role of the Australian Crown in it. David has been National Convener of Australians for Constitutional Monarchy since 1998 and a board member of the Samuel Griffith Society, a society dedicated to the cause of federalism. In 1991 at Barcelona, he received a World Jurist Association Award as World Outstanding Legal Scholar. He was made a member of the Order of Australia in 1995. He's now involved in a major project to ensure Australians, especially, but not only the young, and those new to the country, are well informed about the way we are governed. This project is called the Crowned Republic and is centred on a new website, www.crownedrepublic.com.au, with an outreach program into the schools, and other new projects he is involved in include Can Do and Direct Democracy. So he is a fully committed and dedicated monarchist, and I would like you to welcome Professor David Flint.
Thank you, Chairman. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the invitation to speak this evening in this fellowship of the Round Table, in which the question is, Western civilization, is it doomed? The great Mahatma Gandhi, during a period of British colonialism, was visiting the United Kingdom on one occasion, asked by a British journalist what he thought of Western civilization, and in particular British civilization, said, "I think it would be a good idea." This evening, my concern is not the products of Western civilization, the art, the sculpture, the buildings, the music. I want to talk about something which I regard as the essence of Western civilization. Is it doomed? Is Western civilization doomed? If we throw our minds back to 1939, it is surprising to be reminded as to how close it was to being doomed when two very evil empires were circling Western civilization and obviously had as their aim the end of Western civilization as we know it. At that time, only a few countries were left outside of their circle. Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, India, a few others. The United States at that time was neutral. And it's worthwhile for us to recall that moment because it was a crucial moment for our civilization. As you know, we were led out of that by the leaders of the then group of British countries, Commonwealth countries, Winston Churchill and Roosevelt, who you can see here signing or agreeing to the terms of the Atlantic Charter, which is really the basis of the way in which the world would develop after the Second World War. I want to come to this country because I think it is a microcosm of Western civilization. And modern Australia, as we know, was founded in 1788 by the penal colony established here to place the convicts which could no longer be placed in the United States. It's relevant when we're thinking about our country and its origins to remember the founders of this country. One, Lord Sydney, who in many ways has been dismissed as an unimportant person. The person after whom this city was named. He was a very liberal man, and he wanted to ensure that in Australia constitutionalism was maintained. And the interesting thing is that both he and Philip were determined about one thing, and that was something which was an institution in all parts of the world. They were determined that slavery not be instituted, never occur in this country. If we look at Philip's writings, you'll see that he said from the moment he came to Sydney, or Jackson, the first thing that would happen, or what would immediately happen, would be that the laws of Britain would come to Australia, but he was determined, as was Lord Sydney, that the institution of slavery be completely unknown in this new country. Remember that the institution of slavery existed at that time throughout the world. It had existed in most civilizations. At a time before, a few years before the foundation of New South Wales, there was a very important case, forgotten now, a very important case in the British courts before this judge, Lord Mansfield. It's called Somerset's case, and it's something which caused a major stir not only in Britain but particularly in the colonies of the United States. It was about a runaway slave called Somerset. Rich Americans in those days used to go to London with their slaves to look after them. Some of them ran away. This man, Somerset, was caught. And there was a case. He was defended by a number of interested people, the sort of people who would lead to the movement which eventually Lord Wilberforce led to end slavery. They were determined that Somerset should not be taken back to slavery in the American colonies. The case went before Lord Mansfield. It dragged on. He tried to persuade them not to proceed with the case, but they insisted. Eventually, he handed down his decision, and we don't have verbatim law reports as we have today, but apocryphally it is said, and he may well not have said it, but it was probably said, if it wasn't said by the judge, it was said in argument. He is alleged to have said, "The air of England is too pure for a slave to breathe. Let the slave go free. The air of England is too pure for a slave to breathe." This case, apart from being wonderful, not only for Somerset, but for the thousands of other escaped slaves who found themselves in England at that time, this caused a major stir in the United States, particularly in the southern, what wasn't the United States then, in the southern colonies. They demanded that the British legislate to reverse this decision. The British didn't seem to be at all interested. And it, along with a wish to move into the Western lands, which King George had reserved for the Indians, and along with no taxation without representation, was the cause of the American Revolution. We're told now that the only cause of the American Revolution was no taxation without representation. It was the fear that the liberation of the slave, signalled by Somerset's case, would be followed as a precedent, would have to be followed as a precedent in the United States, and also that the land to the west would remain forever Indian lands and not be handed over for development by the colonists. I come now to the foundation of this country, and I would suggest to you there are 6 pillars which relate to the foundation of Australia. I'm not saying that these are essential for Western civilization. It wouldn't be so silly as to say that. But from it, I think we can find what is the essence, the political essence of Western civilization. And the essence of the foundation of Australia, the pillars of Australia, firstly, was founded under the Crown. Secondly, it was founded with the English language, probably the most advanced, certainly the language with the greatest vocabulary in the world, the language which is the language of the future of this planet. It was founded under Judeo-Christian values. That doesn't mean that people of Australia are expected to be religious, but the values which Philip brought, which were applied in the early years, were essentially Judeo-Christian, and that of course still has a strong influence in Australia, although religion has significantly declined in this country. The fourth thing that Philip brought was not, as some say, a gulag. Some say, and Robert Hughes, in his great work about the foundation of this country, says that it was a British gulag, and that has been repeated by others. It was not. It was founded under the rule of law. And the proof of this may be seen in a decision of the Judge Advocate. Within a few months of the foundation of the colony, the Judge Advocate, David Collins, had a convict appear before him. His name was Cable. It was case Cable and Sinclair. You can actually read the report of the case in a wonderful collection put out by Macquarie University of early cases in Sydney. It's probably the first civil case in Sydney. He was brought by Cable, who was a convict, and the story is wonderful, but we don't have time to go into the story. But he and his wife, they were allowed to marry when they landed, he and his wife were suing the master of one of the ships, who was supposed to bring some valuable goods that they had brought with them from England. They're suing him because he claimed that they were lost and it was thought that he had stolen them. And he was brought, the captain of the ship was brought before the court in Sydney. We're talking about a few months after the foundation of the colony. The case was heard, witnesses were heard, and the Judge Advocate gave his decision in favour of the convict. It's all reported. It was a very substantial pecuniary award of damages. Can you imagine this occurring in a Soviet or Nazi gulag? The very idea of being able to sue your jailers is something so alien to a gulag. New South Wales was a harsh penal colony, but from the very moment that Philip proclaimed the colony, we lived and have lived since under the rule of law. The other 2 pillars of Australia are responsible government. The British gave, when they were in the process of giving responsible self-government to the colonies before the Eureka Stockade, which was a dispute over tax. The legislation was already in the British Parliament to give colonial constitutions to most of the states, except Western Australia, of course, because that was considered too small. We had responsible self-government, and the other thing was federation. Federation is significant because it was the most peaceful federation which has ever occurred in the world. One without violence, without any deaths, without war, without even assaults on people. Quite extraordinary. No other country's ever done this. But it was done with the approval of the people. And what I would suggest is that what we can draw from this, if Australia is a an example, and I would say a very advanced and sophisticated example of Western civilization. It is essentially constitutional liberalism. That's what is at the essence of Western civilization, constitutional liberalism. And what is that constitutional liberalism? Let's go back to the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was something of extraordinary importance in the history of the world because it established a principle that everybody, including the Crown, is subject to the law. Something which was denied on vast parts of mainland Europe until into the 18th or in some places in the 19th century. We know, for example, under the reign of Louis XIV, Louis XIV made that famous statement, l'état c'est moi, I am the state. I make the laws. Here in 1215 we have the principle established under the Magna Carta that everybody, including the Crown, is subject to the laws. Western civilization, was it the other great revolution which is remembered? The other great European revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution? I think few people would think that. Many would say, and Americans would often say, well, it's the American Revolution. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Man was created by God with certain undeniable rights, including the right to liberty, life and happiness, pursuit of happiness. But the American Revolution was essentially derivative of an event in England. In fact, if you look at the Bill of Rights in America, they really trace back to the English Bill of Rights. The most significant development, most significant political development, I would say, you may disagree with me, I would say in the last 1,000 years, was the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 established the principle that the king ruled with Parliament. It established certain basic concepts which were adopted by the Americans when they adopted their constitution. The king could no longer try to make laws himself. He had to go with Parliament, proceed with Parliament in the making of laws. And most significantly, that's William and Mary, it was an absolute contrast to the alternative which was beginning to spread across Europe, that is French absolutism. In fact, the reason why James II was overthrown and forced to flee from England was that he was attempting to set up in England something akin to what was happening in France, where you had an absolute monarchy. In England, what was established was a first version of the constitutional monarchy, where the king led the government, but was only part of the legislature. In that, legislation had to be signed by the king. This was the model, incidentally, sometimes forgotten. This was the model in 1688, which formed the basis of the model for the American Republic, with an executive president who is not part of the Parliament. A very crucial and important part of the Glorious Revolution of 1688 was the Act of Settlement, mainly remembered now because it establishes the Protestant succession to the English crown. It ensured that the crown would not go back to the Catholic descendants of James II, but would stay with his daughter and her descendants, that is Mary, and her husband, William of Orange, would continue down without any Catholics taking the throne. The fear being that if a Catholic came in, this would reverse the trend back to the influence of the Stuarts, and particularly the sort of thing that was happening in France, an absolute monarchy. But the Act of Settlement is crucial for one of the most significant developments in constitutional developments in the West, and that was, in the Act of Settlement you find provision that the judges are no longer to hold office at pleasure, they are to hold office during good behaviour. Here's the very first time that the judges get tenure. Until then, the king or the government could remove the judges. from the Act of Settlement. Curious that it's in an act which relates to the succession of the crown, but here is established the principle: judges can only be removed for misbehaviour, and that has to be to the satisfaction not only of the government, to the satisfaction of both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Exactly the same principle applies in this Parliament here. If a judge misbehaves, it goes to the Judicial Commission, but the actual removal has to be by a resolution of the Legislative Assembly and the Legislative Council. The same in Canberra. A federal judge can only be removed by a resolution finding the judge has misbehaved by both the House of Representatives and the Senate. That's contained in the Act of Settlement. Montesquieu, who found the separation of powers, found this in England, and it traces back to the Act of Settlement. And this is a great principle. The idea that in a constitution should be a liberal constitution in which there are checks and balances on power. This is something which an academic sitting in a university didn't write down and dream up and have a revolution and ensure that this prevailed. This is something which was fallen upon, it evolved, and it is something which is one of the most precious parts of our constitutional systems. That is, that we have the separation of powers, that the judiciary is not under the control of the government of the day, although appointed effectively by the government, that the judiciary is independent of both the legislature and the government. And this, I think, really brings us to the essence of Western constitutional liberalism, which is, I think, the flower, the very essence of Western civilization. And it's best expressed, I think, by Lord Acton when he said that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. If there's one proposition which is central to Western civilization, at least advanced political civilization, it's that statement by Acton. I don't know why I'm touching this thing. Anyway. I think the other principle that comes from the other political principle of Western civilization is something expressed by Edmund Burke, the great Irish statesman. Burke said that society is a partnership. It's a partnership between those who are alive today, those who have gone before, and those yet to be born. And there's a continuum in Western civilization, in the political system which allows for the establishment of Western civilization. So what is the essence of Western civilization? I don't think it's to be found in the French Revolution. It's to be found in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when this very important principle is found, which is constitutional liberalism, checks and balances on power. Now, I think I'm taking a lot of time, so I think it would be better if I stopped at this point and allowed other speakers to continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Flint, for that challenging and learned presentation. Some of us may have known some of those facts, but there's nothing like the inspiration of a brush-up to know on what foundation you're standing. That's very important. Now, I'd like to introduce our second speaker.